Okay, everyone, we're going to go over what I think are the most important nuances for a body weight squat, and then we'll go into a back squat and a front squat. I'll do a few, you can watch me from the front and then watch me from the side, and I'll go through the things I think are most important when you're looking at this. This is important as an assessment tool, also as an exercise, so we'll go over, like I said, the most important things and maybe what they mean, when you should correct it. So looking from the front, the main thing I'm looking for, if we start from the top down, if you think of the trunk and the pelvis, I'm looking for a trunk lean to one side or the other, or a pelvic shift over to one side or the other. So just to give you a little example, if someone squats down, sometimes they dip out into one side or the other, either on the way down or on the way up. Don't worry too much about the details of what these things mean. Just know that they probably mean either the person is reluctant to bear weight on one side because of strength or pain, or sometimes there's some sort of a mobility problem in one of their hips that will lead them to shift to one side or the other. You can also look at the trunk. It's unusual, but sometimes someone will come out of it and maybe lean over. It's rare. It usually is a result of the pelvis dipping over. So first thing is to really focus on is the pelvis. The second thing to look at is the person's hip, knee, and foot alignment, kind of all combined. You're going to look at if they come down into the squat, does one or both knees, do they buckle inward? Do they toe out too much? Do they bear weight on the outside of their foot in order to have the knees come out? If the knees cave in, you want to take a look at where you think that's coming from. Is it coming from their hip, or does their foot and ankle buckle inward? So there's a lot of things to look at when you're looking at the knee in terms of, is the hip or the foot and ankle taking control and making that problem come out. So we'll do a few that look pretty good for me anyway. So you can see I try to keep my knees tracking roughly over my second and third toe. I've got pretty even weight distribution between both feet. My trunk is pretty upright. And that's a decent looking squat from the front. From the side, we're going to look at a few other things now. So looking from the top down, the trunk, now there are a few things you're going to see very commonly. So the first thing that can happen is people are going to, as they come down, they may roll into trunk flexion, which we don't want. Or another thing that's equally common is that people hyperextend. A lot of people think that when you squat, you're supposed to stay very vertical, so they'll overcompensate for that. So maybe they try to do something like this, and they're going into too much extension. The trunk should stay in neutral. So meaning that when I sit down into a squat, it's perfectly okay, and in fact necessary, for my shoulders to live in front of my hips. My shoulders will never be completely vertically stacked up over my hips. So most of the time when people are trying to do that, they're either afraid or sometimes it's just a habit, it's what they learned is correct. So the first thing is to look at neutral spine, and the motion forward comes from the hips. So as they sit into the squat, the motion forward doesn't come again from trunk flexion. It's my spine staying relatively neutral. And as I sit low into the squat, that position does not change. What changes is my hip. So my hip flexes while my trunk remains neutral. The second thing that I'm looking at is my knee in relationship to my foot. So as we discussed a little bit in lecture, having your knee come over a little bit in front of your toes is perfectly okay for a squat. For me, that happens a little bit. If you watch, my knee comes forward a little, but some people are here. There's a little bit of variability. Don't worry too much in this case if their knee comes over their toes. I told you guys about that patient who literally showed me a squat that looked like this. That's a problem. He developed knee pain from squatting like that. I almost fell over doing it too. So there's definitely an amount of forward progression of the knee over the foot that you don't want. But I would say if you're within, a couple of centimeters in front of the toes, it's generally considered okay in a squat. Those are the main things you're looking at from the front and the back. The other basic thing I should mention now is the width of the stance. You can see that the way I sort of instinctively do it is kind of what I learned when I was lifting, which is I'm a little bit outside shoulder width, I toe out slightly, it feels comfortable for my hips. Some people like to be a little more narrow. Some people really go wide. This all becomes a matter of preference. What you guys want to look at now is, does the width of the person's stance impact any of these other parameters we're talking about? So for example, for me, my hips are a little bit stiff. So if I go very narrow in my stance, watch what happens as I go below parallel. My spine starts to round out a little bit, and I can't really stop that from happening. We talked about this with hip mobility. Now if I open up some, it's a lot easier to dip lower and maintain a pretty good neutral spine. So for right now, that's the main thing you want to think of with hip width. When you're watching each other do this in lab, see if you notice any changes when you change the stance width. One last thing, if a person likes to squat really wide, you have to be extra careful that the person doesn't lose control of that, what we're talking about, where the kneecap tracks kind of behind the middle of the foot. So some people, if they squat really wide, they start to do something like this. You don't really want that. You want to have somebody maintain that relationship between the patella and the middle of the foot as they squat down and maintain that good position.